I'm Emily Shepworth. It's November 1st, 2013, and I'm here with my grandfather from South Carolina, and we are going to discuss the anti-war protest movement on Vietnam. Do you remember the Vietnam War?
Well, I do. My name is William Shapworst, and I remember it somewhat, not as well as I would like, but I think some of these dates are 50 years ago.
Yes, how old were you at the time?
1960 was a big year for me. I graduated from law school at NYU, and that was early in the year. Then I married your grandmother in July of 1960, and also we moved to Minneapolis, Minnesota, where I joined a law firm and began to practice law.
So you were living in Minneapolis, you said?
At the time, just before I was married and moved to Minneapolis, I had been living in Brookings, South Dakota, where I was a legal resident, because a person who's away being a student doesn't change his residence for that usually. And I had been in Glacier National Park in 1959 all summer, where I met your grandmother, and we were married then later.
So going back to the Vietnam War, what were your opinions about it? A lot of the students, were against it. What were your opinions about it?
Well, I think the country was doing the right thing when it moved to support the government of South Vietnam. That government had been our friend from the very beginning, and it would have been awfully difficult for the United States to turn its back on that group and walk away. And in fact, it did not. And why shouldn't we have been able to support it successfully, as we had the government of South Korea? And since then, where we've been successful in supporting groups that we choose to support.
So how did you feel about the people who were against it? Did you feel anything towards the protests, or did you just kind of ignore them?
We were in Minneapolis, and I was very South Dakota oriented, and there was nothing more placid or stable than the Midwest. And for the most part, people got along without paying much attention to affairs in Vietnam at that time. It was still kind of early in the game, and I would say that nobody was terribly upset. As far as individual protests were concerned, individual or group protests were concerned, there weren't any in Minneapolis or South Dakota or in that area. And so far as politics is concerned, you can talk about that endlessly, I guess, but we were looking in 1960 at the election of JFK.
Yes.
And for the most part, he enjoyed great popularity, and I think again, for the most part, nobody was too upset. At that point, it certainly looked as though the United States could support the South Vietnamese government sufficiently to allow it to become successful.
And during the Vietnam War, there was the draft, and you had kids during this time, correct? You started to have my dad and...
Well, you wouldn't remember, but yes, in 1961 we had our first child. We had another in 62 and another in 64, and in 67 they were all boys and subject to the draft. But I never gave that a thought, because they wouldn't be subject to the draft until possibly 18 or 20 years after their birth, and that was a long way off, and nobody can predict what things will be like that far away.
And even though they would be, or they were really young, did you still have any feelings for or against the draft?
No, the draft came along with Johnson, if I remember correctly. I hope I'm not wrong on that, but I think Lyndon Johnson started the draft. There was no draft until then. There had been a draft during the Korean War, so it was not new to people. When I was in college, the Korean War started the year that I started college, and we all had that in mind. And my choice of college or whatnot was certainly affected by the draft that was in effect, was going to be in effect at that time. That would have been 1950, and I chose to go to college. College students were exempt from the draft, and at least while they were in college. I signed up for Air Force ROTC, which is another exemption, and ended up going into the Air Force, which was not an exemption. I served 3 years in the Air Force, and against a 3-year commitment. And at the end of that commitment, I went to law school. I didn't care much for the draft, but it was not a considerable problem for me, and I recognize the necessity of having it. Had it not been for the draft, the country could not have waged the North Korean War as it had, and successfully. And I suppose that without something like that, we wouldn't have any success in Vietnam either.
So you were a U.S. attorney, and do you remember prosecuting maybe people who like skip drafts or something like that?
That was one of the things that we did. The draft law came along, and with the beginning of the draft, there were a lot of people who violated the law, and that'd be a federal violation, and it came to our attention. The FBI would investigate such cases and bring us the facts, and we would file the cases and take them to a jury. And I must say that we had no difficulty with getting jury verdicts. You'd have thought if there was a lot of rampant dislike of the draft that you'd have trouble getting convictions from jurors no matter what the facts were, but that never was the case. Of course, the law said a person who's drafted validly has to do these things, or he's subject to a penalty, and the people that were on juries in Omaha, Nebraska, well, in the District of Nebraska, which would be the whole state of Nebraska, were willing to enter convictions against people who had refused to step forward when their name was called, or refused to appear for the draft, or whatever. And it was always like that. As a matter of fact, however, when an individual violated the draft law and was prosecuted by us successfully, and I think we never lost a case because the facts were always open and shut. When that happened, when there was a conviction, then the kindly judge would enter judgment, but the probation officer, I think that was the sequence of events, would explain to the young, newly become felon that if he wished to sign up for the draft or maybe enlist in service to his liking, that the conviction would probably be set aside. In every case where there was a conviction, the gentleman who was convicted chose being drafted or entering the services one way or another.
And did you ever feel bad for the people who just didn't really want to go to war? Did you feel bad for prosecuting them?
No, I really did not. And the gentlemen in my office, who at least 2 of them were veterans, did not either. They thought they had played the game and had not been successful, or had been successful, I guess. And it didn't bother me. I'd been in the service, and it seemed to be every young man's duty to spend some time with the military.
So going back to the protests against the Vietnam War, do you specifically remember any of these demonstrations?
The Midwest is not a hot protesting area. There are very few protests. I've never heard of one in South Dakota, and I suppose there have been many in Minnesota, but I can't think of any, or in Nebraska either. And while there was a considerable public movement against the war in Vietnam, it didn't show its face particularly in Nebraska, where I was U.S. attorney, or in the states nearby either.
Did you like see any on TV or in the newspaper or anything like that, or you just didn't really know anything about it?
Well, the office was covered by the media, but I can't recall any coverage that stands out particularly in my mind. Draft convictions were not big news, that's for sure. I don't think there were any public protests in Nebraska while I was living there, or in the other nearby Midwestern states. That was not happening.
Okay. Well, just your own opinion, do you think that these protests that were going on, do you think they actually influenced politicians and the president about the Vietnam War? Do you think they were effective?
Oh, I'm sure they did, and I think sometime being out in a Midwestern state, we thought they were being more effective than they should have been. But I think mostly it was Nixon who was president as these questions really came up. I'd have to say that they acted responsibly and wisely, probably more so than we out in the Midwest. We were not sympathetic, particularly with the protest movements that were popping up here and there.
Yeah.
And we didn't know much about them either.
Right. Well, do you remember the Gulf of Tonkin resolution? Do you remember that?
Yes, we do. I remember when that happened, and it seemed like at about that time there was nothing but bad news on Vietnam, and all of a sudden, why, according to the news accounts, a couple of Japanese torpedo boats had engaged a couple of United States destroyers, which, and it's on its first appearance looks like suicide on the part of the Vietnamese torpedo boat people, because the ships are not comparable at all. And we supposed, although it never was clear in the news, that the destroyers had promptly disposed of the torpedo boats. I don't recall hearing that they had sunk anything.
And do you think because they showed this on the news that this, made the protests more, occurring more?
I really think that bit of news, the attack by the torpedo boats on the destroyers, made the people of the United States a little bit proud that they had been engaged and the attackers had been put down, if they were, and I don't know what the actual facts were. And I think I know what the consequences were in Washington. Congress gave Johnson the power he needed to expand the United States involvement in Vietnam beyond what it had been, almost without limit, to expand its involvement. Did require a declaration of war, for example, which is the constitutional power that you expect in the case of wars to be exercised by the legislature. It was a case where Johnson was given power without legislative review, particularly, to apply whatever force was necessary.
Yes, this kind of goes back into like one of the questions I had about like resources. Like with all the resources that we had, like why do you think we didn't win the war? And why didn't we, fully engage, I guess?
Well, to their credit, America's leaders were reluctant to get involved in the Vietnam War, and I don't blame them too much for that. They were slow to get involved and took every opportunity not to endanger too many American soldiers in the place. But eventually they did get extremely heavily involved, and it was because Johnson and the military caused it to happen. And I don't think people in the area that we lived in were unhappy with Johnson for that. Johnson was a Democrat, but he had always been a conservative. Of course, back in Johnson's earlier days, he was part of the Solid South, and the Democrats were as conservative as the Republicans were. And although the Southern Democrats had become Republicans, Johnson still was known for his conservative views, and I think his point of view and his advice was given great weight by the people in the part of the country that I lived in. Maybe less so in other places. I'm quite sure that's true, like in Washington. In New York, where I went to school and kept up with the news, it didn't seem as though that was true. But I think for the most part, people in the part of the country I lived in were happy with Johnson, thought he was doing a good job, and that point of view lasted throughout his reign, his tour, whatever you call it, his term.
Yes. Well, do you think if the protests didn't occur, do you think the war would have lasted longer?
Had there not been the protests, I don't know. I think Washington understood the protests and became very reluctant to engage fully in Vietnam. I think what caused the protests more than anything else, and what probably brought about a change in the feeling on the part of people in the country, was the draft. The draft came along. We'd had the draft in the Korean War, and that seemed to be accepted by everybody. But as in the Vietnam War, it was not accepted, and probably it was the draft that caused the problem. Look at later conflicts where we have not had a draft. It seems like we've been able to do almost anything militarily that is decided upon by our leaders without having virtual non-compliance or non-acceptance by the American people. We've gotten along with military engagements all over the world, and not too much trouble with American personal individual reluctance to go along with it. But in Vietnam, that was not the case. There seemed to be a lot of opposition to the draft. And that was, to a degree, true even in part of the country where I live. Nobody liked the draft very much.
I wouldn't like the draft if there was one today. One of like a massive demonstration was on October 21st, 1967 in Washington, D.C. It was named the March on the Pentagon. Do you remember hearing about this?
I'm sure at the time I would have been well acquainted with it, but at this point, thinking back, I don't remember, and I had never attached great significance to it, like I probably would have had it been apparent that made a big difference. Mm-hmm. It might have made a big difference, but if it did, we weren't aware of it out in where I was.
Is there another thought or memory that you would like to talk about during your life? during the Vietnam War? Or anything you want to add?
Well, I'll never forget the fact that at the time I left the Air Force, I was on a combat-ready crew that flew B-36s, which are long-range bombers, and were being withdrawn from the service as obsolete. They were propeller-driven planes primarily, and the wing that I was attached to at Rapid City, South Dakota, was going to B-52s. They brought a B-52 in to show everybody at the time of the switch. I flew about half of the B-36s down to Tucson, as a matter of fact, with an aircraft commander, where they were to be retired or sent to Puerto Rico, or another group was going to take them on. They were of a more modern version than what the Puerto Rico people had. And my term came to an end about that time, and I was allowed to leave the Air Force by the Air Force. Not that they had a whole lot of choice, and I've always wondered what might have happened if I'd stayed and flown in B-52s, because there were B-52s actively participated in the Vietnam War, and many of them were shot down. And it's hard to say that I wouldn't have survived, but certainly there's a big possibility that I might have been.
Yeah, that's weird to think of.
I hate to think that I had walked away from my good friends and all in their time of need, but on the other hand, I'm glad I made the decision I did and didn't have to accept that risk.
Mm-hmm. Did you miss flying, or?
Miss flying?
Yeah.
Yeah, I liked what I was doing, believe it or not, but it didn't seem like what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. I had no concept of what the Vietnam War was going to become, but I could have continued with flying. I decided I'd go to law school instead. I got a wonderful scholarship at NYU, and that had something to do with it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, if you had a chance to relive those years again, is there anything that you would change?
I don't know what could have been done differently, really. They did not raise troops for the difficulty in the Mideast that we had with 2 Gulf Wars and and the Afghanistan thing and the various other things. We did not have a draft for that. An awful lot of troops were added to the rosters and exposed to hazards of combat. And that seemed to work all right. I have a feeling that if the government had decided to raise an army without the draft, that it would have worked, and that the Vietnam War wouldn't have gone the way it did. Although the main problem with our position in the Vietnam War was that the Vietnam people in South Vietnam did not appreciate, were not loyal to, and did not strongly back the South Vietnamese government. And that meant that all of South Vietnam was hostile territory as far as U.S. troops were concerned. It would have been awfully hard to wage a successful campaign or war in South Vietnam with that situation. And I can't think of any way that could have been overcome. The French colonial era had a lot to do with, I think, the way things had become. And what more we could have done to overcome that, I don't know. The Vietnamese people wanted to govern their own country, and they didn't care, thank you, for our assistance.
Yeah, I guess that would be a reason why we really why we were reluctant, right?
Right. Probably that should have been more persuasive to our leaders than it really was. Now, why the South Vietnamese people were strong backers of us, and the strong Korean people, why our intervention in Korea worked and it didn't work in South Vietnam, I can't explain to you, but I suspect the French colonial policies and experience had a lot to do with it.
Back to this event in history. What mistakes do you think? Like, what was a big mistake you think people made during this time?
Well, I think our big mistakes start with the draft. The draft was very difficult. We'd had a draft for the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think probably the wars there would have been unacceptable to the American people. Had it not been for the draft, we probably would have, we might very well have been successful in South Vietnam. There were still other problems like the lack of acceptance by the South Vietnamese people of American power.
Well, we're talking about all this bad stuff going on, the protests and the draft and everything, but do you think there's anything that people should remember about this time that was good?
Well, I think everybody ought to remember that sound protest, or at least a vigorous protest, is going to have considerable effect on our government and on the ability of the government to do what it wishes to do, and on the country. Protesting is as American as almost anything, and you can't be too critical of protest. People that have opinions are entitled to go out and display what they are.
So you think the protests are what people should remember the most about this event?
Well, I think probably the government ought to please its constituency more than it did in the case of the South Vietnamese affair, so that the protests and to the degree that there were in the Vietnam case don't crop up again. I don't recall that there having been much protesting in connection with Iraq, and my gosh, we went in there once and fought the Iraqis and came back later with another president and fought them again, and then we went to Afghanistan, and the American people sat back and allowed that all to happen, and so I think proper preparation and all can allow the United States government to withstand a reasonable amount of protests. I think any protest that is widely accepted and participated in is going to have an effect on government, more probably than it does on conservative citizens in conservative parts of the country.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your opinions on all this. It was really interesting to hear about what you thought about this time, because this time is learning about it in school. I don't really quite understand the Vietnam War, so it was nice getting a perspective, and thank you so much for coming down here and letting me interview you.
Well, thank you for your patience and your attention. I appreciate that. I hope this helps you in what you're doing.